By the summer of 1941, the war in Europe had already crossed every known threshold of violence. But on the eastern edge of the continent, something different was taking shape. Not a campaign that escalated, but one that began without limits, and moved forward as if restraint had never existed. This channel examines World War II through the moments when assumptions hardened, decisions narrowed, and history moved forward with fewer options than anyone expected. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. In the years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, European militaries convinced themselves that they had learned something fundamental about modern conflict. War could still be destructive, but it could be managed. Violence could be regulated. Suffering could be contained within defined categories, processed through rules, conventions, and institutions that separated combat from annihilation. By the late 1920s, this belief had hardened into doctrine. The experience of 1914 to 1918 had been catastrophic, but it had also produced paperwork. Millions had died, yet the war had ended with treaties, commissions, and conventions meant to prevent a repeat of its worst excesses. Among the most important of these was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It did not outlaw brutality. It attempted to organize captivity. Prisoners were to be registered, fed, housed, and exchanged. War, even in defeat, was meant to retain administrative shape. By the 1930s, this system was not theoretical. It was rehearsed. Military legal departments studied it. Quartermasters planned for it. Officer training assumed it. Captured soldiers were no longer just enemies. They were future entries in ledgers, subject to inspection, ration scales, and reporting requirements. This was not humanitarian idealism. It was reciprocal logic. The assumption was simple and widely shared: if both sides followed the rules, captivity would remain survivable. If both sides treated prisoners as assets rather than burdens, the system would hold. Western militaries did not expect kindness. They expected predictability. By 1939, as war returned to Europe, that assumption still stood. When German forces invaded Poland in September 1939, the campaign was violent but brief. By May 1940, the defeat of France was decisive. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were taken prisoner in weeks. They were marched, processed, catalogued. Camps expanded. Ration tables were adjusted. The German army's prisoner of war system, though harsh and often inadequate, functioned within an understood framework. By late 1940, British and French prisoners were being held across Germany. They received mail. They were assigned labor. Their survival was not guaranteed, but it was expected. The machinery of captivity turned steadily. This experience reinforced belief rather than challenged it. Even under a regime that had already demonstrated ideological extremism, war between states still appeared governed by inherited constraints. Violence had a ceiling. Atrocity had limits. That assumption would not survive contact with the East. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as the largest land campaign in history. More than 3 million German troops crossed the frontier in a single morning, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. The scale was unprecedented, but the confidence behind it was familiar. German planners expected a rapid collapse. The Red Army, they believed, would disintegrate under pressure. Soviet soldiers, encircled and disorganized, would surrender in vast numbers. The campaign timetable assumed it. Rail schedules, fuel allocations, and occupation plans were built around it. What was not built into those plans was captivity. There was no comprehensive preparation for housing millions of prisoners. No expansion of camp infrastructure proportionate to expectations. No long-term provisioning plan. The assumption was that the war would end before such measures became necessary. But beneath that optimism lay a more consequential belief, one that had nothing to do with logistics. Unlike Britain, France, or the United States, the Soviet Union had never signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. German legal advisors noted this. Military jurists discussed it. The absence was not overlooked. It was recorded. In peacetime, this distinction had meant little. In war, it became decisive. Within the German High Command, the lack of a formal treaty relationship was interpreted not as a gap to be bridged, but as a release. If the Soviets were not bound by the convention, Germany, it was argued, was not obligated to apply it in the East. Reciprocity, the foundation of restraint, no longer applied. This was not a spontaneous conclusion reached in the heat of battle. It was articulated before the first shot was fired. In the spring of 1941, as invasion planning accelerated, legal memoranda circulated within the command structure. They outlined a new framework for the coming war. The conflict in the East, these documents argued, would be fundamentally different from the war in the West. It would not be governed by the same expectations, nor constrained by the same rules. The war against the Soviet Union was framed not as a conventional conflict between states, but as a struggle against a political system. That distinction mattered. It allowed categories to shift. Soldiers could be reclassified. Civilians could be redefined. Protections could be withdrawn. By early June 1941, the implication was clear: on the Eastern Front, the existing rules of war would not apply by default. They would apply only if explicitly ordered. No such order came. When the first Soviet units were encircled in the opening weeks of the invasion, surrender did occur. Entire formations laid down their arms. Columns of prisoners stretched for kilometers. In some sectors, German forces captured hundreds of thousands of men in days. But these prisoners did not enter the familiar machinery of captivity. There were no prepared camps to receive them. No ration stocks set aside. No transport allocated to move them inland. Many were held in open fields, surrounded by barbed wire, without shelter. Food deliveries were irregular or non-existent. Medical care was absent. This was not yet policy. It was a mission. The German command structure had assumed that captivity would be temporary, that surrender would be followed by collapse, that the problem would resolve itself. Instead, the number of prisoners grew faster than any system could absorb. At the same time, the legal ambiguity surrounding their status discouraged improvisation. Officers were uncertain what obligations applied. Guards were given minimal guidance. The absence of clear rules did not create compassion. It created drift. By July 1941, reports from the front noted rising death rates among Soviet prisoners. Starvation. Exposure. Disease. These reports were acknowledged, filed, and largely accepted as unavoidable. The assumption that war could be regulated had not been violently overturned. It had simply been withdrawn. From this point forward, the Eastern Front would not be shaped by excess alone, but by absence. Absence of obligation. Absence of reciprocity. Absence of constraint. The war had entered a space where rules no longer defined behavior, and where decisions would increasingly be made not to restrain violence, but to channel it. The door that closed in this act was subtle but irreversible. Once a war begins without a framework for limitation, one cannot be constructed later under pressure. From here on, escalation would not need justification. It would only need authorization. If the first act of the Eastern Front was defined by absence, the second was defined by instruction. By the time German forces crossed into Soviet territory on June 22, 1941, the framework of the war had already been altered on paper. What followed was not improvisation under fire, but the execution of decisions made in advance, written down, distributed, and acknowledged. In March 1941, 3 months before the invasion, senior German commanders gathered to finalize operational assumptions for the coming campaign. These meetings were not focused on tactics alone. They addressed governance, occupation, and control. The expectation was not merely military victory, but transformation of the territory itself. Out of this process emerged a series of directives that quietly redefined who was entitled to live through defeat. One of these orders concerned a category of men who did not exist in Western armies in the same form. Political officers. Within the Red Army, political commissars were embedded at every level of command. Their role was ideological supervision, morale enforcement, and loyalty to the Soviet state. German intelligence had identified them as the backbone of resistance, the agents who would prevent collapse, enforce discipline, and sustain the fight even when operational logic suggested withdrawal. They were also civilians in uniform only by technical definition. On June 6, 1941, the German High Command issued a directive formally titled the Guidelines for the Treatment of Political Commissars. It would later be known simply as the Commissar Order. The language of the document was precise. Political commissars captured during combat were not to be recognized as prisoners of war. They were to be separated from other prisoners and executed immediately. No trial was required. No documentation was necessary beyond confirmation of identity. The order was circulated through the chain of command. Senior officers acknowledged receipt. Many discussed it privately. Some expressed concern about discipline and morale. Others noted its political sensitivity. But it was not rescinded. This directive did more than authorize killing. It redefined the meaning of surrender. Under the laws and customs of war as understood in Europe since the 19th century, surrender was transactional. A soldier laid down his arms. In exchange, his life was preserved. That exchange was the foundation of restraint. It was the reason encirclements ended. It was the reason wars, however destructive, eventually slowed. The Commissar order broke that exchange. For one category of soldier, surrender no longer offered protection. Once that distinction existed, it did not remain isolated. German units in the field quickly encountered practical problems. Commissars did not wear unique insignia. They were not always identifiable. Soviet officers removed political armbands. Enlisted men claimed not to know who served in which role. Faced with ambiguity, enforcement widened. Field reports from the summer of 1941 indicate that German units began interpreting the order broadly. Suspected political officers, party members, educated soldiers, Jews, anyone believed to represent ideological commitment rather than military necessity. The line between execution and combat blurred. At the same time, news traveled in the opposite direction. Soviet soldiers learned quickly that surrender did not guarantee survival. Accounts of executions circulated among units retreating eastward. Survivors carried word of mass shootings, of prisoners taken aside and never returning. This information did not provoke panic. It produced calculation. If surrender meant death, surrender ceased to be rational. By July 1941, German commanders began reporting unexpected resistance. Units that should have broken instead fought to exhaustion. Encircled formations launched desperate breakouts rather than capitulate. Casualties rose on both sides. From the German perspective, this appeared as fanaticism. From the Soviet perspective, it was adaptation. The Commissar order had eliminated the incentive to stop fighting. German officers noted the change without fully grasping its cause. Intelligence summaries remarked on Soviet stubbornness. Field diaries described battles that continued longer than anticipated, even when the tactical situation was hopeless. The assumption that ideological enemies would collapse under pressure was quietly contradicted. But the order remained in force. Some commanders attempted to soften its application. Others ignored it selectively. Many enforced it rigidly. The inconsistency itself became corrosive. Soldiers learned that mercy was discretionary. Prisoners learned that survival depended on chance. By late summer 1941, the effects compounded. German casualty rates increased. Prisoner numbers declined relative to encirclements achieved. Fighting intensified at the tactical level, even as strategic momentum slowed. What had been designed as a measure to weaken resistance had hardened it. The order also carried a deeper implication. By declaring certain enemies unworthy of capture, it normalized killing outside combat. Execution became administrative. Violence became procedural. Once killing was justified by category rather than action, the threshold for restraint dropped across the board. This was no longer a war in which rules failed under strain. It was a war in which rules had been deliberately removed where they mattered most. By the end of 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers were dead or missing. Many had never been registered as prisoners. They had disappeared into a system that no longer required accounting. The door that closed in this act was surrender itself. From this point forward, battles on the Eastern Front would not end when one side lost the ability to continue. They would end only when one side was destroyed. The war had narrowed again. By the late summer of 1941, German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Kiev had fallen in September. Smolensk had been encircled earlier, in July. Entire regions were now under German control. On maps in Berlin, the campaign still appeared successful. On the ground, the reality was less orderly. The Red Army had not collapsed. Soviet industry was evacuating eastward. Resistance continued. Most critically, the German army now occupied a landmass whose population numbered in the tens of millions. Feeding it had never been part of the plan. This was not an oversight discovered too late. It was a calculation made early and accepted in advance. Long before the invasion began, German economic planners had confronted a constraint they could not escape. Germany could not feed itself and fight a prolonged war at the same time. British blockade measures were already tightening by 1940. Imports were limited. Domestic agriculture was insufficient. Any large Eastern campaign would place additional strain on a system already operating at its margins. Someone would have to go hungry. In early 1941, this problem was addressed not by military commanders, but by civilian officials within the German economic administration. Among them was Herbert Back, State Secretary in the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Back was not a general. He did not command troops. His responsibility was supply. His conclusions were blunt. According to planning documents prepared in the spring of 1941, Germany could not simultaneously supply its army, its civilian population, and the population of the occupied Soviet territories. The numbers did not balance. Grain yields in the Western Soviet Union were substantial, but transport infrastructure was limited. Rail lines ran east to west, not north to south. Cities depended on food brought in from distant agricultural regions. To redirect food to Germany, those cities would have to be cut off. This became known, internally, as the Hunger Plan. The logic was framed as necessity. German soldiers had to be fed. German civilians had to be fed. The war could not be lost because of bread shortages. The occupied population, therefore, was expendable. The plan did not list victims by name. It identified regions, urban centers, consumption zones, surplus producing areas. The so-called Black Earth region of Ukraine and southern Russia was marked as a source. Major cities outside that zone were marked as sinks. The expectation was explicit. Tens of millions would die. Internal memoranda estimated that approximately 30 million people in the occupied territories would be unable to sustain themselves once food flows were redirected. This was not treated as a failure condition. It was accepted as an outcome. The German army was informed. Occupation directives instructed units to secure agricultural production, seize grain, and prioritize transport westward. Urban populations were to receive minimal rations or none at all. Soviet prisoners of war were explicitly placed at the bottom of the supply hierarchy. This hierarchy mattered. In the autumn of 1941, as the German advance slowed and winter approached, supply shortages began to affect German units themselves. Fuel ran low. Ammunition deliveries fell behind schedule. Food distribution became uneven. At no point did this result in increased provision for prisoners or civilians. The hierarchy held. Soviet prisoners continued to be held in open-air enclosures. Rations, when issued, were insufficient to sustain life. Death rates rose sharply. By November 1941, in some camps, mortality exceeded 50%. These deaths were not hidden. They were reported. Army Group logistical summaries noted prisoner losses due to starvation and exposure. The tone was administrative. Numbers were recorded. Causes were identified. No corrective measures were ordered. The Hunger Plan was not an order in the traditional military sense. It was a framework. Once in place, it shaped every subsequent decision. When transport capacity was limited, food moved west. When storage was scarce, grain was requisitioned anyway. When cities ran out of supplies, no relief followed. Starvation became the default condition. For civilians in occupied cities, the effects were immediate. By late 1941, food rationing systems collapsed. Black markets emerged briefly, then failed. People sold possessions. Then they sold labor. Then there was nothing left to sell. German occupation authorities recorded the decline without intervention. Mortality increased. Disease spread. Work capacity fell. The occupied territories became less productive over time, but the plan did not adjust. The flow continued. This was not indifference. It was prioritization. The German leadership had accepted that the war in the East would be decided by endurance. Feeding the enemy population was incompatible with that goal. The contradiction between military occupation and economic extraction was resolved by choosing extraction. By December 1941, as German forces stalled outside Moscow, the scale of death behind the front had already reached into the millions. Most of it occurred without gunfire. There were no battles. No massacres in the conventional sense. People simply stopped being fed. This form of violence did not require constant supervision. Once systems were aligned, starvation proceeded on its own. The assumption that war could be separated from civilian survival had now collapsed entirely. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant had been rendered meaningless by supply policy. The door that closed in this act was sustenance. From this point forward, survival on the Eastern Front would not depend on obedience, surrender, or compliance. It would depend on access to food. And access to food had already been decided. The war had narrowed again. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had passed a threshold that no order could reverse. German assumptions had already been dismantled. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Moscow had not fallen. The campaign timetable had failed. But the deeper failure was not operational. It was structural. The systems that governed how enemies were captured, fed, and restrained had ceased to function entirely. This collapse did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Throughout late 1941, reports from the front described a pattern that German commanders struggled to categorize. Soviet units increasingly refused surrender, even when surrounded. Isolated formations fought until ammunition was exhausted. Small groups launched night breakouts against armored cordons that could not be penetrated. German officers noted the behavior with frustration. It appeared irrational. Encirclement had always been decisive. Now it was merely destructive. What those reports did not yet acknowledge was that surrender had been removed as a rational option months earlier. By this stage of the war, Soviet soldiers understood what capture meant. They had seen prisoners starved in open fields. They had heard accounts of executions. They knew that officers and political personnel were singled out. They knew that survival depended less on compliance than on chance. The Red Army adapted accordingly. Soviet field orders from late 1941 emphasized resistance under encirclement. Breakout attempts were encouraged. Units were instructed to destroy equipment rather than surrender it. Individual initiative was rewarded when it prolonged resistance, not when it preserved life. This was not ideological fanaticism alone. It was situational logic. When surrender offers no protection, restraint disappears. German units began to experience the consequences directly. Fighting became closer, bloodier, and less predictable. Casualties increased. Rear area security deteriorated as bypassed Soviet units operated behind the lines. The assumption that captured territory equaled controlled territory no longer held. In response, German behavior hardened further. Field commanders authorized harsher reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding partisans. Villages near ambush sites were burned. Hostages were taken. Collective punishment became routine. These actions were justified as countermeasures, but they were also symptoms. The distinction between front line and rear dissolved. At the same time, German soldiers themselves absorbed the logic of the environment. When enemy fighters did not surrender, prisoners became liabilities rather than assets. Guards were reluctant to escort captives under fire. Units under pressure made decisions quickly, often fatally. Killing prisoners ceased to be an exception. It became a perceived necessity. This escalation was not centrally orchestrated at this stage. It was systemic. Once reciprocity collapsed, individual decisions aligned with survival rather than doctrine. German command structures noticed the shift. Staff reports from early 1942 remarked on increased Soviet resistance and declining prisoner intake. These observations were framed as enemy brutality, not as feedback. The possibility that German policy had created these conditions was rarely acknowledged. On the Soviet side, the cycle continued to tighten. As the Red Army absorbed the losses of 1941, it rebuilt under new assumptions. Training emphasized endurance. Discipline hardened. Desertion was punished severely. Retreat without orders became unacceptable. Survival was tied to resistance, not surrender. The battlefield became a space where death was expected, and mercy was unreliable. This mutual hardening produced a feedback loop. German actions reinforced Soviet resistance. Soviet resistance reinforced German reprisals. Each side interpreted the other's behavior as proof of inherent hostility, rather than as adaptation to policy. By mid-1942, the Eastern Front had stabilized into a form of warfare unlike anything seen in the West. Battles were not decided by maneuver alone. They were decided by exhaustion, attrition, and the willingness to absorb losses that would have been politically unacceptable elsewhere. The rules that once governed war between states no longer applied in practice. They existed only on paper, disconnected from the environment they were meant to regulate. The war had not become brutal because hatred intensified. It had become brutal because restraint no longer served survival. The door that closed in this act was reciprocity itself. From this point forward, neither side could plausibly expect mercy, nor offer it without risk. The conflict had narrowed into a struggle where endurance replaced calculation, and destruction replaced negotiation. The war moved on. By 1942, the Eastern Front no longer required new orders to remain brutal. It sustained itself. The critical transition had already occurred. Violence no longer depended on ideology, improvisation, or even command intent. It was embedded in systems that operated automatically, long after their original assumptions had failed. German leadership still spoke in the language of control. Directives continued to circulate. Front lines were redrawn. Operational objectives were revised. But beneath this activity, the environment of the war had hardened beyond adjustment. One of the clearest indicators was scale. By the end of 1941, Approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war had been captured. By the spring of 1942, more than 2 million of them were dead. The majority had not been executed. They had starved, frozen, or succumbed to disease. These figures appeared in reports. They were aggregated, summarized, and transmitted upward. They did not provoke emergency meetings or policy reversals. The system was functioning as designed. At this point, even if German leadership had wished to reverse course, the mechanisms no longer allowed it. Camp infrastructure was minimal. Transport capacity was insufficient. Food stocks were committed elsewhere. Guards were understaffed. Civilian populations in occupied zones were already malnourished. Any attempt to improve conditions for prisoners would have required reducing rations for German soldiers or civilians. That trade-off was never seriously considered. The war economy had narrowed choices until none remained. On the battlefield, the consequences became more visible. As German forces pushed south toward the Caucasus in the summer of 1942, the logistical strain intensified. The front extended farther than supply lines could support. Units advanced on schedules that assumed rapid victory, not prolonged resistance. When resistance continued, supply collapsed locally. Hunger spread forward as well as backward. German soldiers now encountered starvation not only among prisoners and civilians, but within their own ranks. Rations were cut. Improvised foraging increased. Theft became common. Discipline frayed. Yet the hierarchy persisted. Prisoners continued to receive the least. Civilians followed. Soldiers came next. The German homeland remained the priority. This ordering was not enforced daily by ideology. It was enforced by accounting. Each decision to move a trainload of grain westward removed alternatives elsewhere. Each kilometer advanced increased dependency on requisition. Each delay amplified scarcity. The system rewarded continuation, not correction. On the Soviet side, the war also hardened into process. By 1942, the Red Army no longer expected humane treatment in captivity. Training, propaganda, and discipline reinforced a single message: survival depended on resistance. Capture was failure. Escape was redemption. This belief shaped behavior at every level. Soviet soldiers fought longer, retreated less, and accepted losses that would have been unsustainable in 1941. Encirclements still occurred, but they no longer yielded mass surrenders. They produced annihilation. At Stalingrad in late 1942, this logic reached its extreme. German and Soviet forces fought block by block in ruins that offered no shelter and little supply. Prisoners were rarely taken. The concept of captivity had lost meaning. Soldiers on both sides understood that survival depended on holding ground, not yielding it. The battle did not create this condition. It revealed it. By the time the German Sixth Army was encircled in November 1942, the assumptions that had governed German planning were already gone. Relief was unlikely. Surrender was unthinkable. Endurance became the only remaining option. What followed was predictable. When surrender finally came in February 1943, more than 90,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would return home after the war. The system did not discriminate by nationality. Once restraint collapsed, it did not selectively reappear. This was the final irony of the Eastern Front. Policies designed to eliminate limits on violence did not preserve advantage. They removed safety nets for everyone. By late 1942, the war had reached a state where individual choice mattered less than position within the system. Soldiers did not decide whether to be merciful or cruel. They responded to an environment where mercy no longer functioned. The door that closed in this act was agency. From here on, the Eastern Front would continue not because leaders chose escalation, but because no structure existed to stop it. The war narrowed again. By the end of 1942, the Eastern Front had become something neither side had originally planned, yet both now inhabited. The German invasion had begun with assumptions of speed, collapse, and controllable violence. The Soviet response had initially relied on scale, space, and endurance. Both sides believed the war would resolve before its internal contradictions became decisive. They were wrong. What emerged instead was a conflict in which restraint was not eroded by accident, but removed by design, omission, and calculation. The brutality that followed was not an emotional descent. It was a structural one. After the war, German officers struggled to explain what had happened in the East. In memoirs and interrogations, many pointed to climate, distance, or Soviet resistance. Some spoke of ideological pressure from above. Others emphasized the breakdown of discipline under extreme conditions. Few acknowledged the earlier decisions that had shaped those conditions. Yet the record was clear. Before the invasion began, German planners had chosen not to extend the rules of war eastward. Before the first encirclement closed, they had authorized execution outside combat. Before the first winter set in, they had accepted mass starvation as a logistical necessity. Each decision narrowed options. Each assumption removed alternatives. By the time the consequences were visible, reversal was no longer possible. On the Soviet side, the war produced its own lessons. The Red Army learned that survival depended not on protection under law, but on resistance without expectation of mercy. Doctrine hardened accordingly. Discipline tightened. Losses were accepted as unavoidable. Victory, when it came, was measured not in preservation, but in endurance. This understanding shaped Soviet military culture long after 1945. The Eastern Front did not become brutal because one side abandoned humanity and the other embraced it. It became brutal because systems replaced restraint, and policy replaced reciprocity. Once surrender ceased to function as a mechanism of survival, every engagement moved closer to annihilation. Once food became a weapon, civilians ceased to exist as a protected category. Once execution became administrative, killing required no further justification. The war did not spiral out of control. It followed the logic that had been built into it. In the post-war years, international law expanded. New conventions were drafted. Protections were clarified. The experience of the Eastern Front loomed large in those discussions, though it was often referenced obliquely. What the war revealed was not simply the capacity for cruelty. It revealed how quickly restraint collapses when it is treated as conditional. The Eastern Front stands as a case study not in hatred, but in assumption. In the belief that limits could be selectively applied. In the confidence that rules mattered only when reciprocated. In the expectation that violence could be escalated without transforming the nature of war itself. History learned these lessons late, and at enormous cost. By the time the fighting ended in May 1945, more than 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. Millions of them had not fallen in battle. They had vanished into systems that no longer required their survival. The Eastern Front was not inevitable because people chose brutality. It was inevitable because, step by step, the structures that once restrained violence were removed, until nothing remained to stop it. That was what the war revealed. And by the time it was understood, the choices had already disappeared. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.